There's a special kind of fear that comes from being truly alone, when you realize there's no one around to hear you scream. Welcome to Night Encounters. In this video, you'll hear 5 terrifying true stories of people who vanished in the wild, where isolation breeds an overwhelming sense of dread and the unknown. These are allegedly true accounts. Story 1. The Vanishing Hiker by Emily. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 23 years old. My friends and I had decided to go on a weekend hiking trip to the Appalachian Trail. We were experienced hikers, so it wasn't a big deal, just a bit of fun. We set out at dawn, our packs heavy with water bottles and snacks. The sun was warm, the sky clear. Everything felt perfect. The trail was mostly quiet, save for the sound of our boots crunching on the gravel. I remember feeling relaxed, looking at the distant trees, listening to the wind rustling through them. That's when I noticed a single figure ahead, walking alone. There was something odd about them, just a silhouette, but their pace was off. Too fast, like they were rushing toward something. I could see nothing else, just that shape. I shrugged it off. It was the wilderness, after all. Nothing unusual about seeing someone ahead. It wasn't until later that day, as we were making camp near a stream, that things began to feel wrong. We had set up our tents, cooked dinner, and were settling in when we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. It wasn't a bear, it was lighter, human. I froze, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my friend Sam, who was closest. He nodded, his face pale. "Who would be out here this late?" he asked, his voice tense. We both looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But nothing. It was eerily quiet again. We shrugged it off, maybe a little too easily. We figured it was some other hiker or maybe an animal nearby, but there was this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next morning, the weirdness started to build. The air felt thick, as if we were being watched. At breakfast, Sam was the first to notice it. "Look, someone's been here, it's fresh," he said, pointing to a set of footprints near the fire pit. We checked our gear to make sure nothing was disturbed, but everything seemed fine, except that the tracks seemed to lead off into the trees, deeper into the woods. No sign of a return path. "Maybe it's just someone else on the trail," I said, but I didn't feel convinced. As we packed up camp and continued our hike, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following us. It was subtle, at first. A rustle of leaves behind us, a figure darting out of view just a little too fast. And every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing. My gut told me to leave, but I brushed it off. We had only a few miles left to go before we reached the end of the trail, and I wanted to get it done. The next part is the part I'll never forget. I was ahead of the group, trying to get some space to clear my head. The air was thick, the forest was too quiet. That's when I heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable, my name being called. "Emily." My heart nearly stopped. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but then it repeated louder. "Emily." I spun around, expecting to see one of my friends. But there was no one. Nothing but the trees swaying in the wind. Then, out of nowhere, a figure stepped into view. It was the same person I had seen the day before, the one who'd been walking ahead of us. But now, something was off. Their face was hidden in the shadow of the trees, their posture unnaturally stiff. My stomach churned. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, eyes locked on the figure. But then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished back into the trees, as if the woods had swallowed them whole. I didn't wait around to find out more. I turned and sprinted back to the group, my heart hammering in my chest. We packed up faster than I'd ever seen any of us move. My mind was spinning. What had I seen? Who was that? Were we being watched? We made it to the trailhead in a hurry, and the rest of the hike was a blur. By the time we reached the parking lot, I could barely breathe, and I couldn't look back. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw that day. My friends dismissed it as paranoia. But my gut told me otherwise. We later found out that there had been reports of missing hikers in that area, and no one ever really found out what happened to them. I haven't been back to that trail, and I don't think I ever will. Story 2: The Disappearing Camper by Daniel. It was a solo camping trip. I had just moved to Colorado and figured it would be a great way to clear my head. The weather was perfect, and the campsite I picked was secluded, just the way I wanted it. I didn't mind being alone in the woods. In fact, it was one of the main reasons I came out here. I set up my tent by a quiet creek and spent the day fishing, reading, and enjoying the peace. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountain when I noticed something strange. From across the creek, I could see a flash of movement in the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, maybe an animal, maybe a person. But it seemed off. I stood still, trying to figure it out, but whatever it was, it vanished. That night, the air turned colder. As I sat by the campfire, roasting marshmallows, I felt like I was being watched. Every crack of the fire, every snap of the trees felt louder than usual. The creek, usually gentle, was gurgling more aggressively. It felt like nature itself was on edge. I looked around, but there was nothing out of place. The forest was silent, but there was this heaviness in the air, this presence that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off as nerves, told myself I was just being paranoid. I wasn't used to being alone in such a remote area. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it intensified as the night wore on. I kept hearing something moving, not far off. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was human footsteps. But each time I turned around, I saw nothing. Then, at one point, I heard a voice. It was faint, a whisper on the wind. "Help!" My heart stopped. I stood up, straining to hear. It came again. "Help me!" I grabbed my flashlight and rushed toward the sound, my hands shaking. But when I got there, there was nothing. No person. No sign of anyone. Just the rustling of trees and the dark shadows of the forest. I returned to my campsite in a daze. That's when I noticed something strange by my tent. Footprints. Fresh footprints. They led straight to my tent and stopped. But no one was there. There was no sign of anyone at all. My stomach twisted into knots. My mind was racing, but I couldn't figure out what was happening. I should have left then, but something, stubbornness, maybe, kept me there. That's when I heard it again. The whisper, louder this time. "Help!" I turned around, and this time, I saw something. A figure, standing in the trees, watching me. I could barely breathe as my heart pounded in my chest. My eyes locked on that figure, my instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could move, they disappeared into the trees. I grabbed my gear, packed it up in a hurry, and didn't look back. I ran to my car, not even bothering to zip up the tent. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I was being followed. I haven't gone back to that spot. In fact, I haven't gone camping since. The police never found anything, and the footsteps were never explained. But I know what I heard and what I saw. Something, or someone, was out there, and they wanted me to see it. Story 3: The Missing Boy by Sarah. It was supposed to be a weekend camping trip with my younger brother, Lucas. He had just turned 16, and it was his first real hiking trip. I had been to this part of the forest a few times before, and I knew it well enough. We packed our gear, hiked through the dense trees, and set up camp beside a small lake. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze. We spent the afternoon fishing and joking around, enjoying the solitude. Lucas was excited, always so eager to prove he could handle things. I thought it was the perfect way to bond, a nice break from our hectic lives back home. As the evening drew in, we made a fire. We were sitting by it when Lucas suddenly stood up, looking into the woods. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. I strained my ears. There was something, distant, barely audible, a voice, maybe. It seemed to echo through the trees. But it wasn't clear enough for me to make out. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to brush it off. But Lucas wasn't convinced. He stared into the woods for a long time, his brow furrowed. "I'm going to check it out," he said, before I could stop him. I watched as he walked into the trees, his silhouette fading into the growing darkness. I didn't think much of it at first. Lucas was always adventurous, but as minutes ticked by and he didn't return, an uneasy feeling began to settle in my stomach. The sun had completely set by now. I kept calling his name, but there was no answer. I could hear the wind picking up, rustling the leaves around me, but there was something about the silence that felt unnatural. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the trees, calling his name again and again. My heart pounded in my chest as the darkness swallowed me up. Every rustle made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw him. But it wasn't Lucas. It was a man, standing still, facing away from me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. "Lucas?" I called out, voice shaking. But the man didn't respond. The figure suddenly turned and walked into the thick trees, disappearing without a sound. I had no idea what to make of it. But then, through the dim beam of my flashlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold: Lucas's backpack, lying abandoned at the base of a tree. I sprinted back to the campsite, panic rising in my chest. I grabbed my phone to call the authorities, but there was no signal. That's when I heard it, Lucas's voice, faint and distant, calling for me. But it wasn't coming from the trail, where I had just been. It was coming from deeper in the woods, from the direction the figure had gone. I followed the voice, my feet slipping on the uneven ground, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had to find him. The voice kept calling, almost as if it was mocking me now, growing fainter and fainter the further I went. And then I saw it, Lucas's body, lying in a clearing. But when I approached, it was like he wasn't himself. His eyes were wide open, his body stiff. And his face, it was pale, like he had been drained of all color. I rushed to him, but as I touched his shoulder, his body jolted violently, like a puppet with its strings cut. His eyes locked with mine, but there was something off. Something wrong. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could react, his body went limp again, and I was alone in the clearing. I don't know how I made it out of there, but I ran. I ran as fast as I could, back to the campsite, and eventually found my way to a road where I flagged down a car. The authorities were called. They found Lucas, but he couldn't remember anything. He couldn't recall why he had gone into the woods, why he had wandered off. But the look in his eyes, that haunted expression, stayed with me long after. We left the woods that night, and I never went back. I don't think Lucas ever will either. Story 4, The Disappearing Family by Greg. It was meant to be a family getaway, just my wife, 2 kids, and I, heading up to the mountains for a week of hiking and exploring. We'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to disconnect and spend time together in the great outdoors. The cabin we rented was remote, nestled in the heart of the woods. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything we needed: warmth, seclusion, and a panoramic view of the surrounding wilderness. The first few days were peaceful, almost perfect. But on the 4th night, something happened. Something that would change everything. It started with a strange noise. We were sitting around the fireplace after dinner when we heard what sounded like a faint tapping on the window. At first, we thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But when it continued, 3 distinct taps, then a pause, then 3 more, it didn't feel natural. My wife, Jessica, was the first to get up and check. But when she opened the window, there was nothing outside. "Just the wind," she said, trying to reassure me, but I could tell she was shaken. The next morning, things started to get even stranger. Our youngest, Ella, claimed she had seen a man outside, watching the cabin from a distance. When I went out to check, there was no one. The tension kept building. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I would hear strange sounds in the night, footsteps just outside the cabin, the scraping of something on the walls. Then, one afternoon, we decided to take a hike along a nearby trail. The forest was thick, the path narrow, but it was beautiful. We were halfway through when I turned around and realized Ella wasn't with us. I called out for her, but there was no answer. My heart started to race as I jogged back along the trail. I found her, standing at the edge of the woods, staring at something in the distance. But when I approached, she wouldn't speak. She just pointed silently toward the trees, her eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until that night that things took a darker turn. We woke to find Ella and our son, Liam, missing from their beds. The door was wide open, the cold night air rushing into the cabin. I ran outside, calling their names. And that's when I saw it, shadows moving in the trees. I wasn't alone. I barely made it back to the cabin before I heard a voice, faint but distinct, whispering in the wind. It was my wife's voice. It was calling for me, but it wasn't her. Something was wrong. As I turned to look back at the door, I saw them, Ella and Liam, standing in the doorway, their faces expressionless, their bodies unnaturally still. I grabbed them, pulled them inside, and locked the door. The rest of the night was a blur of confusion, fear, and frantic phone calls. The authorities never found any trace of anyone outside. To this day, I have no idea what happened to my family in those woods. Ella and Liam never remember what happened. Jessica and we left the cabin that night, and I haven't been back. I don't think I ever will. Story 4, The Disappearing Family by Greg. It was meant to be a family getaway, just my wife, 2 kids, and I, heading up to the mountains for a week of hiking and exploring. We'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to disconnect and spend time together in the great outdoors. The cabin we rented was remote, nestled in the heart of the woods. It wasn't luxurious, but it had everything we needed: warmth, seclusion, and a panoramic view of the surrounding wilderness. The first few days were peaceful, almost perfect. But on the 4th night, something happened. Something that would change everything. It started with a strange noise. We were sitting around the fireplace after dinner when we heard what sounded like a faint tapping on the window. At first, we thought it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But when it continued, 3 distinct taps, then a pause, then 3 more, it didn't feel natural. My wife, Jessica, was the first to get up and check. But when she opened the window, there was nothing outside. Just the wind, she said, trying to reassure me, but I could tell she was shaken. The next morning, things started to get even stranger. Our youngest, Ella, claimed she had seen a man outside, watching the cabin from a distance. When I went out to check, there was no one. The tension kept building. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I would hear strange sounds in the night, footsteps just outside the cabin, the scraping of something on the walls. Then, one afternoon, we decided to take a hike along a nearby trail. The forest was thick, the path narrow, but it was beautiful. We were halfway through when I turned around and realized Ella wasn't with us. I called out for her, but there was no answer. My heart started to race as I jogged back along the trail. I found her, standing at the edge of the woods, staring at something in the distance. But when I approached, she wouldn't speak. She just pointed silently toward the trees, her eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until that night that things took a darker turn. We woke to find Ella and our son, Liam, missing from their beds. The door was wide open, the cold night air rushing into the cabin. I ran outside, calling their names. And that's when I saw it, shadows moving in the trees. I wasn't alone. I barely made it back to the cabin before I heard a voice, faint but distinct, whispering in the wind. It was my wife's voice. It was calling for me, but it wasn't her. Something was wrong. As I turned to look back at the door, I saw them, Ella and Liam, standing in the doorway, their faces expressionless, their bodies unnaturally still. I grabbed them, pulled them inside, and locked the door. The rest of the night was a blur of confusion, fear, and frantic phone calls. The authorities never found any trace of anyone outside. To this day, I have no idea what happened to my family in those woods. Ella and Liam never remember what happened. Jessica and we left the cabin that night, and I haven't been back. I don't think I ever will. Story 5: The Last Wilderness by Thomas. The first was never much of an outdoorsman, but my friend Alex was. So when he invited me to go on a camping trip in the wilderness of Wyoming, I thought it'd be a good way to push myself. We were supposed to be out there for 4 days, just hiking, camping, and getting away from the chaos of everyday life. Alex had done it before, and I trusted him to show me the ropes. The first day was beautiful. We hiked through lush forests, the scent of pine filling the air, the sun casting a golden light through the trees. We set up camp by a small lake and cooked our meals over an open fire. Nothing about the trip felt strange or out of place. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel wrong. We were sitting by the fire after dinner, talking about life, when Alex suddenly went quiet. I looked over at him. His face was pale, eyes wide, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "What's wrong?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just stood up slowly, his hand reaching for his backpack. "There's someone out there," he said, his voice low and shaky. I laughed, thinking he was messing with me. "Dude, it's just us out here. Stop freaking out." But Alex wasn't laughing. His eyes were scanning the trees. "I'm not joking. I saw movement. It's close." I brushed it off. The woods were full of life, or deer, bears, who knew? It was probably just an animal. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We continued our hike, but every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made my heart race. We set up camp again, but this time, the tension was different. Alex was constantly looking over his shoulder, his hand on the knife strapped to his belt. As night fell, I started to hear things, too. The wind wasn't right. There was a stillness that felt unnatural. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the way the forest was so quiet made my stomach twist. Around midnight, Alex stood up again, the hair on the back of his neck visibly standing. "They're out there," he whispered. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely a murmur. "People," he said. "I don't know how many, but they're watching us." At this point, I was getting scared. It was getting colder, and the sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. There was a heavy, oppressive silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of our campfire light, barely visible against the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. "Alex, did you?" "I saw it," he interrupted, his voice tight. Before I could process what was happening, another figure appeared, closer this time. And then another, and another. It was like the forest was coming alive with people, moving quietly, just beyond our sight. "Get the gun," Alex hissed, his face pale as he grabbed his pack and pulled out a rifle. I didn't even know how to react. The figures didn't approach us. They just stood there, watching. But it was the feeling they gave off, like we were prey, that made the air feel suffocating. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, just staring at them, but eventually, they started to move again, disappearing into the darkness as silently as they had appeared. Alex and I grabbed our things and ran. We didn't even pack up the tents. We just took off down the trail, terrified, barely able to see through the darkness. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, hours later, breathless, covered in dirt and sweat. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. When we told the rangers what happened, they said no one else had been reported in the area. No sign of any other hikers. The whole thing was dismissed. But I know what I saw. And what Alex saw. I haven't been camping since that night. And every time I go into the woods, I feel that same unease creeping back. The wilderness can be a place of beauty and peace, but it can also hold secrets, things better left unseen, unspoken. Thank you for watching Night Encounters. If you have a true story of your own that you'd like to share, we'd love to hear from you. Send your story to nightencountersstories@gmail.com, and it may be featured in one of our upcoming videos. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the things we fear the most are the ones we can't see.